When the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed to the world said never again. Yet since the Holocaust, the world has witnessed and did little to stop genocide and other acts of crimes against humanity around the globe. What is the UN's role in genocide prevention? We'll discuss the moral code, geopolitics, and the responsibility to protect on newsmakers. A recent study by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum indicates 70% of Americans believe the U.S. should prevent mass atrocities worldwide. How to do this is another matter. Dr. Brett O'Bannon is director of the Conflict Studies program at DePaul University. He's in Grand Rapids as a guest of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, discussing the responsibility to protect, which is a philosophy aimed at early prevention of mass atrocities. Wow. Figuring that out would be a key to solving so much of what we see today around the world.
That's exactly right.
So how do you do this?
Well,
what are the components to figuring out, to getting ahead of conflict that leads to genocide?
It's interesting you'd start there.
Well,
because I just had a conversation this morning on campus with students. We sat in on the class, and that was one of the questions raised that kind of got us really moving forward. There's a kind of a dilemma there. If you're going to prevent genocide, one of the things we learned from Rwanda is that it happens quickly. 800,000 people lost their lives in the span of about 100 days, about the course of a semester. If you're going to prevent that, you have to act with dispatch. You have to act very quickly. But that runs the risk of acting too hastily before you actually know that something's going to happen. And if you which is perhaps what we did in Libya, and things have gone very badly in Libya as a result of perhaps our premature intervention there. So it's not at all clear to policymakers when they have to make decisions in circumstances of great stress whether they're about to prevent or see a genocide or some other crime against humanity take place. But one thing we are doing is we're learning more about mass atrocity crimes, and we're starting to understand that they take place in sort of patterned ways, and so we're starting to see more and more effort on interest in early warning systems that will allow us to act with dispatch and in a preventative way. Because, well, the responsibility to protect doctrine started with the principle that the most important element of the responsibility to protect is to prevent these things from happening in the first place.
21st century. Right, we're in the infancy of the 21st century, and yet we have seen how many genocides?
Oh God, that's a good question. Well, we opened with Darfur, started in 2003. We've seen most recently Central African Republic, where the Special Advisor to the Secretary General on Genocide Prevention issued several warnings over the last 18, 24 months. And in between Darfur and Central African Republic, we've seen, well, Syria is now getting the G word, is getting labeled with the genocide word. The Assad regime is, and ISIS as well, have both seemingly been bent on the destruction in whole or in part of entire groups of people based on race, ethnicity, politics, and that's language straight out of the Genocide Convention. So off the top of my head, how many sites or crimes of genocide have we seen committed in the 21st century? I'd say at least half a dozen or so. We're not off to a great start.
So we see it.
Yeah.
And you said the G word. So what is the definition of genocide?
Yeah. It's what I just offered you. It's and the reason I refer to the Genocide Convention is that is what codified the crime into international humanitarian law. It is the attempted destruction in part or in whole or in part of a group of people based on some quality, some characteristic, race, ethnicity, politics, religion. This is why ISIS is targeting the Yazidi. The Christians are deemed genocidal. And actually, I think one of the, kind of an ironic twist, I think one of the reasons the Assad regime has been so assiduous in its effort to win the war, and not doing so, is I think it actually fears, reasonably so, that they would become the victims of genocide were they to lose power. And that existential fear for one's affinity group is always at the heart of genocide. It's this belief that if we don't exorcise this enemy from within, then we stand to lose our place. So that's all to say that, as you surmise, we are not off to a good start.
Well, let's stick with Syria, because it just seems to be front and center with so many people. You have Russian involvement, which there's a connection to the 1990s and Cold War, and we'll get to that.
Indeed.
The responsibility to protect, in this case, there are pillars, as you call them, right?
That's right. That's right. The idea of the responsibility to protect, maybe I should just say a word about where it comes from, because it really has been an effort to guide our thinking in how we ought to respond to crimes crimes, as we say, associated with the R2P. The 1990s, when the Cold War ended, things changed dramatically in the world. Kind of a perfect storm came together. The Soviet Union was gone. Russia joined the Security Council as a more amicable member, a more cooperative member with the Western powers. At the same time, the nature of organized armed violence itself was continuing to change. At the beginning of the 20th century, 8 soldiers died for every civilian in war. By the end of the 20th century, that ratio had reversed itself. 8 civilians dying for every armed combatant. So the nature of war itself was changing, while the international geopolitical structures were changing in a way that was going to lead us to a rapid expansion in our involvement in these conflicts. So the 90s was a really complicated time. It began with civil wars in West Africa that we intervened in, but very late, after many, many, many deaths. Shortly after that, we intervened kind of preventatively to prevent the mass starvation of hundreds of thousands of people in Somalia. But we made some very curious choices in our intervention there, and it went badly, as you know. As a result of having gone terribly wrong in Somalia, we didn't do anything in Rwanda. And we didn't prevent Srebrenica, the act of genocide against 8,000 men and boys in the village of Srebrenica in the former Yugoslavia. But then by the end of the 90s, we were prepared to act in ways that we weren't in the mid-90s. So we bombed Serbia over Kosovo to prevent and bring an end to ethnic cleansing. And we intervened in East Timor. So it was a very complicated decade. Kind of intervening here, not intervening there. When we did intervene, we did it sort of strangely. And so there was a real clamoring for some new ideas, some clarity about how we ought to act, how we ought to respond to crimes of mass atrocity. And those new ideas came in the form of the responsibility to protect doctrine, advanced or articulated in a report issued by an International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, for the very purpose of giving some new thinking, some new ideas about how the international community ought to respond to these crimes. And I think the clamor for new thinking was so clear that that's the explanation for why R2P has been called the most successful idea in the normative arena since genocide prevention, actually. So it stipulates 3 fundamental principles. The first is that sovereign states in the international system, have a responsibility to protect their people. We've normally spoken of states in terms of their sovereign rights, to be free from intervention. But now we're saying sovereignty implies a responsibility to protect the populations under your control. Secondly, the international community has a responsibility to help states carry out those protection responsibilities. That may mean development assistance to build structures of rule of law, you name it, a whole host of possible ways we can help states carry out their protection responsibilities. And then lastly, when states fail manifestly to carry out their protection responsibilities, the international community committed itself in 2005 at the UN World Summit to a timely and effective response to instances of war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. Those are the 3 pillars of the responsibility to protect. And it really has proved to be quite influential. It's, for better or worse, and we can talk about how it's not been, helpful in some respects. I'm a sympathetic critic of R2P. I should put my cards on the table. Nevertheless, it has been massively influential in its very short lifespan.
And there's Syria, which is where we started with this, and which is a great test of the R2P.
And it's failing.
Right. So let's break down what was happening in Syria early on and how the Obama administration, I guess, had drawn that line in the sand. And what happened there?
Yeah.
And what we're seeing now, because you're saying we're flirting with the G word.
Yeah, that's right. It might be worth drawing a parallel or a comparison to the Libya case, because they developed in the same way. You know, the Arab Spring came to the Middle East in 2011, and we saw Ben Ali in Tunisia fall, and Mubarak in Egypt fall, and we saw it spread, these flames spread. And when it came to Libya, peaceful demonstrations emerged, and Gaddafi responded with violent force. And so much so that it transformed peaceful demonstrations into violent rebellions. And when that happened in Benghazi, he threatened to exterminate the cockroaches and the rats. Cockroaches is fraught language in a post-Rwandan world, right? Because that's what the Interahamwe called the Tutsis. So when Gaddafi said, I will crush the cockroaches and I will go house to house and we will kill them, people took him seriously. And the Security Council, with the beckoning of the Arab League itself, acted with dispatch. In complicated and problematic ways, but we acted with dispatch. Syria is essentially the same story. We see the Arab Spring come to Syria, we see peaceful demonstrations, we see a regime that is incapable of responding in any other way, it seems, than with overwhelming force, transforming those peaceful demonstrations into open rebellion. Now that rebellion gets really complicated, it fractures into many, many fronts, and very quickly the Obama administration is essentially tasked with the same, or faced with the same question. Is there something we can do? What responsibility do we have to the victims of this growing violence in Syria? Well, there was no Arab League consensus on Syria as there was in Libya. Russia on the Security Council has a very close relationship, as you hinted to earlier, right, with the Syrian, with the Assad regime, which makes action on the Security Council essentially impossible. They vetoed even the mildest forms of rebuke towards the Assad regime. And China's gone along with it. The reason that China is so assiduous in its defense here has to do with Libya, actually, because it's clear that NATO overstepped the mandate of intervention authorized by the Security Council in the case of Libya. They went quite quickly into a regime change platform, way beyond the mandate of the UN Security Council. And Russia and China felt fooled. So now there's need for action, there's need for some cooperation, there's need for a consensus among the Permanent Five of the Security Council, and you're just not going to get it. And R2P, it has been said, there's this great student paper, undergraduate student paper, published in an magazine on international affairs. It's this long, R2P is dead, long live the R2P, Libya, Syria, and Responsibility to Protect doctrine, saying, interestingly, that the success of R2P in Libya, showing that it could mobilize forces and get things to happen, actually has killed it because of the way that NATO overstepped its mandate. And now when the people of Syria need us, 10 million displaced persons, almost 250,000 casualties, this is just staggering scale. And we can do very, very little.
This is where the windows are so small, they close quickly, and part of this is the idea of military intervention. When to use it, how to use it. Because you have collateral damage potential here, you can make situations worse.
That's right.
So how do you break this down when you have such a small window, when you draw a line in the sand, then you don't act on what you've said?
Right.
We're using this as an example.
Yeah. This is great. It's exactly the right query. R2P was supposed to provide kind of clear thinking about how and when and under what conditions the international community should respond. It was clear from the outset that it was intended to be about significant scale of mass human suffering. This is not about responding to human rights violations on a fairly local level, right, or local scale. Clearly, we've reached the level of mass human suffering in Syria that would have triggered some kind of response in the eyes of the framers of the R2P concept. They employed, however, a kind of more broadly understood just war framework to kind of make sense of how, in terms of establishing criteria. So the first thing is you have to have just cause, right? Meaning there has to be large-scale human suffering. Well, that's clearly the case. But then they went into kind of subsequent criteria. You have to have the right intention. That is, the humanitarian motive has to be the supreme motive. to distinguish, say, from perhaps our intervention in Iraq, which was justified in humanitarian terms, but it's not at all clear that, in fact, it's quite clear that it wasn't about humanitarian motives in many respects. So right intention, you have to be prepared to exhaust every means, the last resort dictum. You have to kind of exhaust every diplomatic and non-violent, non-military option available before you pull that trigger. There is the right proportion, the kind of just proportion. You can use only as much force as required to achieve the humanitarian motive or objective. So they have a kind of clear set of principles that would guide our thinking, and frankly, all of those can be met, I think, except for perhaps one. The reasonable prospects of success dictum demands that if you're going to send in soldiers to fight and perhaps die on behalf of humanitarian motive, there has to be a reasonable chance that you will in fact obtain your humanitarian objective. And to be quite honest, as assiduous as I will be in the call for a more robust response to the Syrian crisis, it is not in fact clear to me that there's a military solution to that conflict that can be brought to bear by outside forces. It's not clear to me. And if that's the case, if I'm right about that, and I think this is what the Obama administration has felt all along, is that they can't win this in a military way, then they can't intervene. They have an obligation not to send soldiers into an unwinnable conflict. So what do you do? I tell my students, if you're not prepared to grapple with dilemma, don't go down this road. Don't entertain this subject, because this subject of humanitarian intervention, of genocide prevention, is just fraught with dilemma.
And it's just part of the human history. You can go back centuries. What is it about genocide?
You are so right. This is one of the darkest conclusions I've reached in my study of mass atrocity. It is part of the human condition. It is not something that has only taken place in the darkness of Africa, or in colonial North America. It has taken place in every corner of the world, in all times. It's biblical, it's contemporary, it's Latin America, it's in the heart of Europe. It is within us all, I think. I'll tell you a quick story. I finished my undergraduate degree at the University of Montpellier in France, and one of the best friends I made that year was a Rwandan student studying agronomy. And at the end of the year, we did what you did that year. We drank some wine, smoked some French cigarettes, and solved the world's problems, right? Well, when we parted, there were tears in our eyes. He was a deeply compassionate man. And I finally thought, I wonder if he survived. So I went looking for his name. He survived all right. He was number 3 at Radio Television Mille Collines, the radio system that sent out the orders for genocide. My friend, this deeply compassionate man, is a génocidaire. He's a mass murderer. When I realized that Anani Nkurunziza, is his name, was a mass murderer, I realized if he can do it, it's within us all. It's, as I say, in every corner of the world and every time. And if Anani can do it, so can I, I'm afraid. You're absolutely right. It is a part of the human condition.
Is it part of the following orders? Is it just part of what is natural in whatever society that you are a part of? Or if you're in a ruling class?
Yeah. That's a really important question. And we're starting to learn, I think, we continue to learn more and more about the order of genocide, as Scott Strauss calls it. For me, I think the central critical element, for one, it's never spontaneous. One of the understandings of Rwanda was it's just the sudden outburst of ethnic hatred. Right? Well, it's never a sudden outburst. Right? It's planned. It's meticulously planned and executed. That's one of the saddest stories about Rwanda, is that we had evidence 4 months prior to the outbreak of violence of the Interahamwe's preparations. We knew where their arms were being cached, and General Romeo Dallaire, the head of the UN force there, asked for permission to go seize those weapons in January of 1994, 4 months before the onset of violence, and he was denied the mandate to do so. One of the things I think is critical is this existential fear I was talking about earlier. I think if you go to the Holocaust, Hitler and company stoked the flames of fear of Jews. That they were responsible for losing World War I. They advanced this Dolchstoß myth, this stabbed in the back myth, right? And so if they didn't exorcise the enemy within, then the fate of the German people was at risk. Right? That's the same kind of message that the Hutu power ideologues articulated in Rwanda over a good decade, kind of leading up to the genocide. That the Tutsis were a threat. They were an ever-present threat to Hutu survival. And if they ultimately didn't get rid of them, they wouldn't survive. And there were some historical reasons for being able to make such a claim, kind of the history of colonialism and things. So I think the critical element, two parts to it, I guess, is a political elite that is actively stoking the flames of hatred and fear, and then the success in achieving that existential fear on the part of the masses. And if you have both of those, if you can obtain that existential fear, this real belief that in fact, gosh, if we don't kill them, then we ourselves will die, is the essential ingredient in getting, as we said in Rwanda, mass participation in mass murder.
You talk about the human condition. There's also human compassion.
Yeah.
And so to that end, there is that concept of a moral code and the distant stranger, as you call it. Yeah. And what is your role to protect or to be responsible for your brother and sister who is the distant stranger?
That's right. The ethicist Peter Singer has a really powerful story that he tells us. He wants us to imagine that we're walking home and we look into the neighbor's yard and we see a child drowning in a pool or a pond. And he just asks a simple question. Do I have an obligation to save that child? It's not going to cost me much. I'm going to get wet, perhaps step in the water, pull the child out. Do I have an obligation to do so? Am I required to do so? Is there anything about being a part of a society that demands I save that child? It's not my child. Well, Singer's pretty clear that yes, you do have an obligation to save that child. You cannot consider yourself a member of society if you do not feel the obligation to step into the water and save a drowning child. So he starts with that, I think, very powerful claim. It's kind of deceptively powerful, right? Because if you accept that premise, that you have an obligation to save that stranger, he advances the second claim, which is that there is no moral relevance to distance. It doesn't matter if the child is in the backyard of your neighbor or 10,000 miles away. If the child is dying at the hands of a genocidal tyrant or from famine, and we have it in our capacity to save that child, we have an obligation to do so. That, for me, is a very powerful starting point. It says to me, for one, I just buy his argument. I think if we are members of a national or an international society, then we have certain obligations to save strangers when it's in our capacity to do so. And for me, that's the starting point of the responsibility to protect doctrine. It starts with the premise that we have an obligation as governments, as states, and as people to protect the lives of people within our control. And if we don't, then our sovereign right of non-interference transfers to the international community. We give up that sovereign right of non-interference. I think those are pretty powerful ideas.
At what point, though, is there a counter-argument to that?
Absolutely, yes. I'm glad you asked this because nothing is cut and dry. Nothing is simple in this domain. One of the critical principles, one of the bedrock principles of international affairs is sovereignty. Sovereignty is basically the idea that it was articulated in the Treaty of Westphalia that brought an end to the 30 Years' War. And in that Peace of Westphalia, there's a little simple expression that says, whoever reigns his religion. Meaning, if the Prince of, Duke of Saxony is Protestant, then he gets to determine Lutheranism for the state religion. If the prince is Catholic, then the prince gets to determine that the state religion will be Catholic. Sovereignty basically started there, and it says, we have a right to be free to determine our own affairs. That's been the bedrock principle of international relations, and we don't dispense with that lightly. So interventionism is juxtaposed against sovereign rights of non-interference. We articulated the sovereignty principle to prevent war. That's worth doing. So there's no simple choice.
Dr. Brett O'Bannon, you're the director of the Conflict Studies program at DePaul University. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.